In some towns, the wheel stood in the square long before the condemned arrived. Not hidden, not guarded, not ashamed, because the point was never justice. The point was visibility. Breaking on the wheel wasn't meant to end a life quickly. It was meant to manage a life, strike by strike, until pain became a public timetable. Courts could even specify the sequence of blows, where they landed, how many, how long the body would remain on display afterward. And that is what makes it different from an execution. A sword ends a person. A wheel turns a person into policy. The wheel didn't belong to criminals. It belonged to the town. It stood in the square like a public instrument, half warning, half instruction, teaching everyone what power looked like when it wanted to be remembered. Medieval justice was not designed to be private. A private punishment ends a life. A public punishment continues working after the body stops. That is why the wheel mattered, because it could be written into a sentence like accounting. A court could decide the order, how many blows, where they landed, whether mercy would come early or be delayed on purpose, and once a punishment can be measured, it can be repeated. The wheel made suffering legible, to the crowd, to the authorities, to anyone considering disobedience. It also solved a political problem, anger. A starving town does not want a lecture about law. It wants a spectacle that convinces it the world is still under control. So, the court staged control. Officials stood close enough to be seen, but far enough to stay clean. Guards kept the crowd at the right distance, near enough to absorb the lesson, far enough not to touch it. And the condemned became less a person than a message delivered in wood iron and procedure. This wasn't justice as morality. This was justice as administration. A system proving it could decide not only who suffered, but how, when, and for how long. The crowd didn't need to be told to stay quiet. They already understood the rules of the square. Silence meant you were sensible. Silence meant you were not involved. Silence meant you were not next. When the condemned was brought in, there was no dramatic moment of justice arriving, just movement, controlled, practiced, familiar. Guards positioned themselves like hinges on a door. Officials stepped forward with the calm of men who would not be touched by what was about to happen. A clerk opened a scroll and began reading the sentence, as if it were a tax notice. Name, crime, authority, and then the part that turned stomachs without raising voices. The method, not whether the body would be broken, but the order in which it would be broken. A punishment like this does not rely on rage. It relies on repetition. The wheel was not an instrument of passion. It was an instrument of clarity. A blow, and the crowd learned what disobedience cost. Another blow, and the town learned the court was still stronger than hunger, anger, and rumor. Another blow, and the condemned stopped being a person anyone could sympathize with. Because sympathy is dangerous in public. This is how the wheel worked best. Not by shocking the square, but by teaching it to watch without moving. What came next was never described as improvisation. It was described as execution, but it behaved like choreography. The condemned was positioned with the same care used to position a symbol. Not too close to the crowd, not too far to be seen. Centered, elevated, unavoidable. Then the first strike landed, and the square learned the real purpose of the wheel. It didn't simply punish a body, it organized a lesson. In many places, the sentence itself could define the rhythm. How the blows would be spaced, how the body would be turned, how long the process would continue before mercy was allowed. Because mercy here was not compassion. Mercy was a policy lever. End it early, and the crowd leaves disturbed but relieved. Stretch it out, and the crowd leaves trained. That is why officials watched closely. Not to witness suffering, to supervise timing. A punishment like this had to remain controlled. Never so chaotic it looked like rage. Never so swift it looked like kindness. The wheel demanded something colder, a calm performance of power, delivered in steps. And as the ritual continued, the condemned stopped being the center of attention as a person and became the center of attention as a reminder. This is where medieval justice reached its purest form. Not violence as anger, violence as administration. The ritual didn't end when the square began to empty. That was the point. A punishment like this was designed to outlive the crowd's attention, so the town would keep learning even after the officials went home. The wheel was not only an instrument, it was a display frame. Authorities understood something simple: pain is temporary, but memory can be engineered. So the body was often left where it could be seen from the road, raised above eye level, beyond reach, turned into a permanent announcement in wood and iron. Not to punish the condemned anymore, to punish the idea of becoming them. Merchants passed beneath it on market mornings. Children learned to look away without being told. Travelers learned the town's laws before they ever heard them spoken. And the court achieved its cleanest victory. A warning that did not need guards, a message that did not need words, a rule that enforced itself through silence. Because once fear becomes part of the landscape, people stop questioning it. They start navigating around it. That is how the wheel truly worked. It didn't just break a person, it organized a town. The town learned a new skill, not how to obey. It already knew that, how to pretend it hadn't seen. Because once the wheel remained standing, once it became part of the square, part of the road, part of the morning routine, every passerby was forced into a choice that never felt like a choice at all. Look or survive. To stare too long was to invite suspicion. To speak too loudly was to invite attention. To show sympathy was to suggest you were next in line for the same lesson. So, people practiced restraint. They lowered their eyes at the right moment. They kept their faces neutral. They taught their children that questions were dangerous in public. And this was not an accident. The wheel did more than intimidate individuals. It trained an entire community in controlled behavior. It turned fear into etiquette. A punishment like this could not function without an audience, but the audience was not there to enjoy it. The audience was there to be shaped by it. Over time, the cruelty became quieter, because the town became quieter. Officials didn't need to shout their authority. They could stand still and let the square do the work for them. That is the final layer of medieval punishment that most histories soften. The court didn't just break bodies. It broke the social instinct to intervene. And once a town learns that silence keeps it safe, the wheel no longer needs to be used often. It only needs to be remembered. The wheel didn't disappear because people suddenly became kinder. It disappeared because power learned new ways to be efficient. As towns grew, as states hardened, punishment slowly moved away from the square and into controlled spaces, behind walls, behind doors, behind language that sounded civilized. Public cruelty has a weakness. It can create witnesses, and witnesses remember. So authorities began to prefer punishments that required fewer eyes, fewer crowds, fewer chances for sympathy to spread. They didn't abandon fear. They refined it. The wheel had been a perfect medieval solution, a visible lesson, a permanent warning, a ritual the town could not ignore. But once fear could be delivered through fines, prisons, records, and reputations, once compliance could be enforced without a scaffold, spectacle became optional. And yet the wheel left something behind. Not splinters, not iron, a habit. The habit of treating suffering as a tool, the habit of calling procedure justice, the habit of teaching a population to look away, then calling that order. That is the real legacy of the wheel. Not the violence, the training. Because when a community learns that silence is safety, punishment no longer needs to be frequent, it only needs to be possible. The wheel was never just a method of killing. It was a language. A town square turned into a courtroom without walls where punishment didn't end with the sentence. It continued in the minds of everyone who walked past the scaffold afterward. That is why it worked. Not because it was loud, because it was repeatable, because it trained people to measure their words, lower their eyes, and call that survival peace. And when the wheel finally disappeared, the lesson didn't. Power simply found quieter tools. Different rooms, different paperwork. The same cold logic. Make fear visible, and the crowd will police itself.